To save my younger brother, I married the ruthless Mafia boss. She had 48 hours to save her brother's life, and only one man on earth could do it. He was not a doctor. He was not a saint. He was the most feared name in the city, the kind of man people crossed the street to avoid, the kind of man whose enemies didn't just disappear, they were never found. Elena Cross had spent 3 years keeping her little brother away from every shadow this city threw at them. In 48 hours, she was about to walk straight into the darkest one. If this story already has your heart pounding, hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because this is only the beginning. Heat. The hospital smelled like bleach and bad news. Elena had memorized that smell over the past 11 days. The way it clung to the back of your throat, the way it mixed with the coffee they brewed too strong at the nurse's station down the hall, the way it made everything feel slightly unreal, like the world was being scrubbed down to its bones, and what was left underneath wasn't pretty. She sat in a plastic chair outside room 14 with her spine straight and her hands folded in her lap because if she slouched, if she let herself go soft for even a moment, she was going to fall apart in a hallway that had seen enough of that already. Milo was 12 years old. He weighed 61 pounds. The doctors used words like progressive and aggressive and irreversible when they thought she wasn't listening close enough, and she had learned to listen close to everything. The diagnosis had come 6 weeks ago. A rare degenerative condition. The kind that didn't have a household name. The kind that didn't have a ribbon or a charity walk. The kind that specialists looked up twice before explaining because even they hadn't seen many cases. There was one viable treatment. An experimental surgical procedure developed by a team in Boston, refined over 7 years of trial, with a success rate that made the attending physician clear his throat before quoting it. 73%. Those were good odds if you were gambling. Those were unbearable odds if you were talking about your little brother. The cost was $2.4 million. Elena had spent 3 weeks doing everything right. She had called insurance companies until her voice gave out. She had applied for every clinical trial, every grant, every charitable fund that existed within reach. She had contacted the hospital's financial assistance office so many times that the woman at the desk had started recognizing her number and letting it go to voicemail. She had sold her car, cashed out a retirement account that barely existed, borrowed from every friend who still took her calls. She had raised $112,000. It wasn't close. The social worker assigned to Milo's case was a tired woman named Greer, who wore the same cardigan 3 days in a row and had the careful voice of someone who delivered impossible news for a living. She had sat across from Elena in a consultation room with a box of tissues on the table between them like a prop, and she had said, with genuine softness, that sometimes families in these situations looked at alternative avenues. Elena had stared at her. Greer had looked back, steady and careful, and said that she wasn't in any position to make specific recommendations, but that she had seen in certain cases, certain people approach certain parties who operated outside conventional channels. Elena had known exactly what she meant. She had driven home that night, sat in her empty apartment, and stared at the ceiling for 4 hours. Then she had picked up the phone and called the only person she knew who might have a number. His name was Carver. He was a low-level logistics coordinator for a shipping company that was a legitimate business in all the ways that mattered on paper. He had dated her college roommate for 2 years. He was soft-spoken and wore ironed shirts and made excellent pasta. And he also knew people who knew people, and when Elena told him what she needed, there was a long silence before he said he was going to pretend she hadn't asked him this, and she was going to pretend she hadn't asked, and then he was going to send her a message in an hour with a name. The name he sent was Damien Vescari. She had looked it up. She wished she hadn't. There were no photographs, or rather, there were photographs that couldn't be confirmed, blurred shapes at the edges of other people's stories. What existed instead was a record assembled in fragments, federal indictments that had collapsed, task force investigations that had been quietly shelved, a string of businesses that paid their taxes and employed hundreds of people and generated clean receipts, and underneath all of it, a current that the newspapers described in careful language because the newspapers that had been less careful had had to print retractions or change editors. Damien Vescari was 41 years old. He had run the Viscari organization for 11 years since his father's death, which was officially listed as cardiac arrest and unofficially listed as nothing because nobody filed a report. He had expanded the organization from a regional power to something that operated in 6 states and had tentacles in things Elena couldn't even name. He was not someone you approached. He was not someone who took meetings with civilians, which made the response she received 24 hours after Carver sent his message to someone who sent it to someone else all the more disorienting. A time, an address, 2 words at the end of the message. Come alone. She had told herself she was just going to hear what he had to say. She had told herself she could walk out at any point. She had told herself a lot of things during the 40-minute drive to a building in the financial district that looked like it housed an architecture firm and probably did, on its upper floors. She had repeated them like a list because lists were the only things that had held her together since the diagnosis. The lobby had no signage for what she was there for. A man in a gray suit met her at the elevator bank, checked her bag without asking permission, and rode up with her to the 14th floor without speaking. The office she was brought to had floor-to-ceiling windows and very little furniture. A desk, 2 chairs, a credenza with nothing on it except a glass of water that had been placed there for her, already poured. She didn't touch it. She had been waiting 6 minutes when Damien Viscari walked in. He was not what she had prepared herself for, which was its own kind of unsettling. She had built a mental image from fragments and rumors, something large and deliberately menacing. The man who entered was tall, 6'2", maybe more, with a lean, spare build that moved without wasted motion, like someone who had long ago stripped efficiency down to its studs. He wore a dark suit with no tie. His face was angular, sharp at the jaw, with eyes that were a very light gray that read cold in the fluorescent wash of the office. He was not ugly. That was, for some reason, the detail she hadn't accounted for. He looked like someone who had been built for endurance rather than comfort. He sat down across from her without extending a hand and looked at her the way you looked at a contract before you signed it. "Elena Cross," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was even, no texture to it. "Tell me what you want." She had rehearsed this. She had written it out in 3 different versions and practiced in her bathroom mirror until the words felt steady. Now, with his eyes on her, steady felt like the wrong ambition. She aimed for clear. "My brother is 12 years old," she said. "He has a degenerative condition. There's a surgery that can save his life, and I cannot afford it. I was told you were someone who could help with problems like this." Something moved across his face. Not emotion exactly, more like the notation of it. "Whoever told you that was imprecise," he said. "I'm not a philanthropist." "I know what you are." He studied her. "Do you?" "Enough," she said. "Enough to know that coming here was either the most desperate thing I've ever done or the most rational. I haven't decided yet." A beat of silence. Outside the window, the city was happening. Cars, pedestrians, the ordinary machinery of a day that didn't know anything about Room 14 or experimental surgeries or numbers with too many zeros. Elena kept her eyes on Damien Viscari and waited. $2.4 million, he said. She went still. She hadn't told him the amount. "You did your research," she said carefully. "I do my research before I take any meeting," he said. "I know about your brother. I know about the procedure. I know what you've raised so far and where it came from." He paused. "I know about your parents." The air in the room changed. She felt it like pressure in her ears. "My parents died in a car accident when I was 19, she said. The line was automatic, worn smooth from repetition. "Your parents disappeared," he said, with no particular emphasis, which was somehow worse than if he'd said it like a weapon. 7 years ago, the car was found. They were not. The investigation was closed after 14 months. He looked at her steadily. "I know things about that situation that you don't. We can discuss it, or we can focus on what you came here for. That choice is yours." Elena's hands were flat on her thighs. She could feel the fabric of her slacks under her palms, and she pressed down against it because she needed something solid. "What I came here for," she said, "is my brother." Something shifted slightly in his expression. Not warmth, a different quality of attention. "Then here's what I'm prepared to offer," he said,
I'll cover the full cost of the surgery, every follow-up, every additional procedure if complications arise. Your brother will have access to the best facilities and the best medical team in the country for as long as he needs them." Elena felt the relief of it before the rest of the sentence arrived, and she hated herself for that, for the way the body responded before the mind could catch up. "In exchange," Damien said, "you'll marry me." The room didn't move. The city outside didn't stop. Everything just continued in the ordinary way while Elena Cross sat completely still and heard the most insane sentence that had ever been directed at her. "I'm sorry," she said, very quietly. "It's a legal marriage," he said, as if she'd asked for clarification on a term in a lease. "Documented, public, recognized by the state. You'll live in the estate. You'll attend events when required. You'll conduct yourself as my wife in all contexts that require it. That's—" She stopped, started again. "Why? That's not part of the offer." "It is for me," she said. The steadiness in her voice surprised her. "You're asking me to give up my life. I need to understand why." He looked at her for a long moment. The light through the windows was very flat and even, and it showed nothing on his face that he didn't allow to be there. "I have interests that require the appearance of certain stability," he said. "A marriage to a woman with no criminal record, no organizational ties, and no history of instability is useful." It was almost certainly not the complete truth. She could feel the edges of where it wasn't, the places where the explanation was just slightly too smooth. But it was an answer, and she was in a room with a man who could have given her nothing. "No romance," he added. "No expectations of that nature. I'm not looking for that." "What about my freedom?" "You'll have more than you think," he said. "You'll have access to the estate and the properties associated with it. You'll have a household account. You won't be watched, but you will be guarded. That's non-negotiable." "How long?" "The marriage will be reviewed at 2 years. If both parties agree to dissolution at that point, it proceeds cleanly. Financially, you'll be compensated for your time." She thought of Milo. She thought of him in that bed, 61 pounds, watching YouTube on a tablet because it was the only thing that didn't make him nauseous. He had asked her 3 days ago if she was scared, and she had told him no, and that was the only lie she had ever told him on purpose. "If I say no," she said. "Then you walk out of here and this meeting didn't happen," Damien said. "I'm not going to threaten you. That's not what this is." She believed him, which was the strangest thing, that in this room, with this man, she found something that registered as credible. Maybe it was the absence of performance. He wasn't trying to frighten her. He wasn't trying to charm her. He was presenting terms the way someone presented terms, and there was something almost nauseating about how much easier that was to process than cruelty would have been. "I want it in writing," she said. "Full scope of the medical coverage, dissolution terms, everything. It'll be drafted before you leave today. I want my own attorney to review it. You have 72 hours. After that, the offer closes." She stood up, her legs held. That felt like a small victory. "I'll need to see Milo first, before I sign anything. I need to see that that the medical arrangements have started." Damien stood as well. He was taller than she'd calibrated for, even having seen him standing. "Preliminary arrangements will begin in the morning," he said. "You have my word." She should have said something caustic about what his word was worth. Instead, she looked at him. Really looked, past the surface of the assessment she'd been running since he walked in, and she said, "He's all I have." Something happened in Damien Vescari's face. It was small, and it was fast, and it was gone before she could catalog it. "I know," he said. She signed the contract 40 hours later with her own attorney present, a sharp-eyed woman named Park, who had reviewed every line twice and pulled 4 clauses for renegotiation and gotten 3 of them changed, which Elena filed away as a data point about what kind of operation she was dealing with. The kind that negotiated, the kind that had enough confidence in its own position to concede small things without feeling threatened. The wedding was 11 days after that, a small ceremony in a room she hadn't seen before, with 6 people present including the officiant, and Milo watching from a wheelchair via a video call because the surgical team, already assembled, already briefed, already frighteningly competent, had cleared him for a 20-minute connection and nothing more strenuous. He looked at the screen with his thin face and his dark eyes that were so much like their father's eyes that Elena sometimes had to look away fast, and he said, "You look nice." His voice was gravelly from the medications. "Don't," she said. "I'm just saying." "Milo." "He looks like the guy from that movie," Milo said, squinting. "He's standing right here." "I know. I'm saying it on purpose." A pause. "Is he actually going to help?" She glanced sideways, and Damien was looking at the screen with an expression she couldn't fully read. Not softness. Something older than softness. "Yes," she said. "He is." Milo was quiet for a moment. "Okay," he said. "Okay. Don't let him be mean to you." "He won't," she said. And she still didn't know if that was true, but she said it like it was because Milo was watching, and that was what Milo needed. They drove to the estate after. She had been shown photographs during the contract process, a condition she had insisted on, wanting to know where she was going, but photographs hadn't prepared her for the physical reality of it. The property sat on 12 acres 40 minutes north of the city, behind gates that operated on a system she didn't fully understand yet, and a perimeter wall that was beautiful in the way that things built to be impassable were sometimes beautiful. The house itself was large without being ostentatious, 3 stories of dark stone and old wood, with grounds that looked maintained by people who took it seriously. A woman named Della met her at the entrance. "Household manager," she explained, with the efficient warmth of someone who understood the geography of her role precisely. She would explain the routines. She would introduce Elena to the staff. She would, and here she paused, measuring something, make sure Elena had everything she needed. Elena looked at her new room and tried to understand what her life had become. The first 3 days were exercises in navigation. The estate was large enough that she got turned around twice, genuinely lost, in a house, which was a specific kind of indignity. She met the security team, who were polite in the way that people were polite when they had been very specifically told to be, and had decided to mean it anyway. She called Park twice about contract details she kept returning to. She called the surgical coordinator in Boston every day because that was what you did when you were waiting for the most important appointment of your life, and all you had was a phone. Damien was rarely present in any room she was in, which she had expected. When they did share space, dinner twice, in a dining room that felt scaled for more people than it contained, he asked her questions that were oddly specific. Whether she needed anything, whether her room was adequate, whether she had concerns about the security arrangement. Not personal questions. Logistics. She answered in kind, and they ate with the careful distance of 2 people who understood exactly what they were to each other, which was strangers who had signed a document. She had told herself she could manage that. She had been right so far. The attack came on the morning of her 12th day at the estate. She was in the car, one of the estate's vehicles, with a driver named Holt, who had a military bearing and eyes that tracked everything, heading toward the hospital for a meeting with Milo's surgical team about post-operative care. They were on the elevated bypass, 40 feet above the river access road, when Holt said something very quietly into the radio clipped to his collar, and then said to Elena, without looking at her, "Get down on the floor." She had read that sentence in books. She had seen it in films. She had never had it directed at her with that particular quality of urgency, the urgency of someone who said exactly what they meant and needed it done in the next 2 seconds. She went to the floor. The rear window of the vehicle shattered. She didn't hear a shot. She learned later that she wouldn't have, at that distance, with that kind of equipment. Only the implosion of glass and Holt's voice on the radio saying a sequence of words she couldn't follow, and the sudden acceleration of the car that pressed her into the floor with a force that was almost physical reassurance, something moving, something responding, someone handling this. They drove for 11 minutes before they stopped. When Holt opened her door, there were 3 other vehicles behind them and 4 men she hadn't seen before, all of them scanning the elevated road behind them with an efficiency that made her feel, absurdly, like she had stumbled into an operation that had been rehearsed for exactly this. She was taken back to the estate. Damien was in the security room when she arrived, standing at a bank of monitors with two men she'd seen but not been introduced to, looking at footage she couldn't see from the doorway. He turned when she entered. He looked at her. A fast, comprehensive inventory. And something in his face that had been very tight released by a single degree. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he turned back to the monitors. She stood in the doorway and thought about Milo, watching via video from his hospital bed, saying, "Don't let him be mean to you." She thought about the contract. She thought about what kind of stability a man like this actually needed that required an arrangement like theirs. And she thought about what her father might have known, what Damien had said about knowing things she didn't, and she thought about the way the rear window of the vehicle had simply ceased to exist. Someone had just tried to kill her, or they had tried to kill the man whose name she was now legally carrying. She didn't yet understand that the answer to that question was going to be the most dangerous thing she had ever learned, and that by the time she understood it, the person she had been before she walked into that office on the 14th floor would no longer exist. That night, after the security debrief she hadn't been included in but had listened to through a hallway she wasn't supposed to be in, she went back to her room and sat on the edge of the bed and finally, for the first time since Milo's diagnosis, allowed herself to be terrified. Not about the window, not about the sniper, or whoever it had been. About the fact that deep in the estate's east wing, behind a door she had been told was a server room but had too thick a frame to be just a server room, she had walked past a sound she couldn't name. Low, rhythmic, like breathing through a machine. Or like something being kept very, very quiet. And she had a feeling, the kind that lived below the level of reasoning, in the place where the body knew things before the mind did, that whatever was behind that door was connected to her parents, to Damien's careful, incomplete explanation, to the reason she was here at all. She was going to find out what it was. She just had to survive long enough to do it. She lay on top of the covers fully dressed, boots still on, staring at the ceiling with the particular alertness of someone whose body had decided sleep was no longer a reasonable option. The estate was quiet in the way that large, guarded places were quiet. Not empty, but contained, every sound absorbed by stone and distance, and the understanding that noise traveled differently here. Somewhere below, she could hear the faint rotation of the security shift change. Footsteps, a door, a radio clicking twice, then nothing. She thought about the door in the east wing. She thought about the sound behind it, that low, rhythmic quality she couldn't categorize, the thing that sat in the back of her mind like a splinter you couldn't locate by touch, but could feel with every movement. She thought about her father. Martin Cross had been, by every account she had been given access to, an accountant. He had worked for a mid-sized firm downtown, had driven a sensible car, had coached Milo's soccer team for one season before his knees started giving him trouble. He had been quiet in the way that some people were quiet, not from shyness but from preference, from an economy of expression that Elena had inherited and her mother had sometimes found frustrating. He had made good coffee and terrible eggs, and he had told Elena 2 weeks before he disappeared that she was the most capable person he had ever known. She had assumed it was a compliment. She had spent 7 years wondering if it was an apology. At 3:17 in the morning, she got up. The hallway outside her room was empty. She had spent enough time learning the estate's rhythms to know this window, the gap between the 3 a.m. check and the 3:30 rotation, when the guard stationed on the residential floor moved to the west stairwell for his own reasons, which she suspected involved a woman who worked the overnight in the kitchen but had never confirmed. 17 minutes. She didn't need many. She moved without a light. The east wing was 2 corridors and a half level down, in a section of the house that was older than the rest, the stones slightly darker, the floors switching from hardwood to something that gave slightly less under pressure. She counted doors. The one she wanted was the 4th on the left, past a linen closet and a room used for storage that smelled of cedar and old paper. The door had a keypad lock that she had noticed, and then pretended not to notice on her second day. She stood in front of it now and thought about what she knew about the estate's security architecture, which was more than anyone had told her and less than she needed. The keypad was a 6-digit system. She pulled out her phone, opened the camera, and held it at an angle to the surface of the keypad under the dim passive light of the hallway. The oils from recent touch showed on the 1, the 4, the 7, and the 9. 4 digits, 6-digit code. The most frequently used keys would have the most residue. She tried the one first, the one she was most certain about, and then made a decision about sequence based on nothing more than pattern recognition and the fact that she had once spent 3 months working data security for an insurance company and had learned that most people, even dangerous ones, chose codes that meant something. She tried 1, 4, 7, 9, 1, 4. The lock released. She stood very still for a full 3 seconds, listening for any change in the ambient sound of the corridor. Nothing shifted. She pushed the door open. The room on the other side was not a server room. It was an archive. Floor-to-ceiling shelving on 3 walls, the kind with lateral drawers and document boxes stacked with a precision that suggested regular use, a long table in the center with a lamp and a chair, and a surface that had the faint ring marks of coffee cups used here many times over many years. On the far wall, a corkboard the size of a door, covered in photographs and documents connected by lines in 3 colors, red, black, and blue, with a density that took her a moment to adjust to, like switching from normal vision to something that had too much information in it. She stepped closer. The photographs were surveillance shots, grainy, time-stamped, taken at distances that required equipment. She saw faces she didn't know, buildings she didn't recognize, cars and street corners, and what looked like a port facility at night. And then, at the edge of the board, near a cluster of documents held with a single clip, she saw a photograph she did know. Her father was standing outside a building she had never seen, in a coat she remembered, with a man whose face was partially obscured by a car door. The timestamp read 7 years and 4 months ago, 6 weeks before her parents disappeared. She reached out and unpinned it from the board. On the back, in handwriting she didn't recognize, confirm contact MC, operational. She was still holding it when the light in the room came on. She turned. Damien was standing in the doorway. He was wearing what he'd been wearing the night before, suit jacket gone, shirt untucked at one side, and he looked like a man who hadn't slept either, which she catalogued and set aside because the more immediate issue was the expression on his face, which was not anger exactly. It was something more complicated than anger. It was the face of someone who had known a thing was coming and had still not been fully prepared for the specific form it took. "How did you get in here?" he said. His voice was very even. "The keypad oils," she said. She held up the photograph. "Why do you have this?" He looked at the photograph. Something moved through his jaw. A tightening, released deliberately. He came into the room and she held her position because backing up felt like the wrong signal, even though every physical instinct was registering the size of him, the contained energy in how he moved. "Sit down," he said. "I'll stand." He looked at her steadily. "Elena, sit down." It wasn't a threat. It was the voice of someone who had something to say that required a chair. She pulled the one from the table and sat in it and held the photograph face up on her knee. He stood at the edge of the corkboard and crossed his arms and looked at her like he was making a decision in real time. She let him. She had learned in the past 12 days that the silences in this house were not empty. They were load-bearing. "Your father worked with my organization for 4 years," he said. "Not for us, with us. There's a distinction. He operated as a liaison between a financial intelligence unit and a network we had connections to. He was gathering evidence of a cross-organizational corruption network that ran through 6 crime families, including mine, and extended into federal contract agencies and the banking infrastructure that serviced them." Elena's mouth was dry. "He was a civilian accountant. He was a trained financial analyst with a deep cover arrangement and a specific mandate," Damien said. "His cover was designed to be irreproachable. It was, for 4 years. Who arranged it? Parties that no longer exist in the same form." "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer I have that won't raise more questions than it closes tonight," he said. "What I can tell you is that 4 years in, your father had assembled a body of evidence significant enough to dismantle most of what I just described, and someone inside my organization found out about it." The room felt smaller. "Who?" "I don't know," he said, and it was clearly a thing he hated saying. The precision of that hatred was visible, contained, directed inward, the expression of someone who had been running a problem for years and was still running it. I've been trying to find out for 7 years. Whatever your father had, whatever he had compiled, it was taken when he disappeared, along with him, along with your mother. He paused. I believe they're still alive. Elena heard the words. She processed them once, then again, then a third time, in case the sequence had been different from what she thought. You believe they're... I believe they went into hiding. I believe they were helped. I believe the evidence they took is somewhere, and I believe there are people who have been looking for it just as long as I have, for much less clean reasons. He held her gaze. I also believe that whoever is looking for it has now figured out that your father might have told you something before he disappeared, or left something with you, or that you might be leverage. I don't know anything, she said. I was 19. He didn't tell me anything. I believe you, he said. The people who put a sniper on your car yesterday morning may not. She sat with that for a moment. The photograph was still in her hand. Her father, in a coat she remembered, standing outside a building she'd never seen. Operational. The marriage, she said carefully. The real reason. Damien uncrossed his arms. He turned slightly toward the corkboard and then back, and she recognized the movement, the physical expression of choosing how much to give. I made a promise to your father, he said. 7 years ago, the last time we had contact, he told me if anything happened, if he had to run, if the arrangement collapsed, he told me to find you, to make sure you and Milo were covered. Covered, she repeated. That was the word he used? He said protected. I said covered. It amounts to the same thing. His voice was flat, but not unkind. When Milo's diagnosis came through, yes, I knew about it before you came to me. I had been tracking both of you since your parents disappeared. I saw a way to fulfill what I'd promised without having to explain any of this to you before you were inside a controlled environment. He paused. I know how that sounds. It sounds like you made a decision about my life without telling me the actual reason, she said. Yes. And brought me into the middle of a 7-year criminal conspiracy. You were already in it, he said. You've been in it since you were 19. You just didn't have the information. She wanted to argue with that. She found she couldn't, which was its own form of misery. The realization that he was correct, that her ignorance had not been protection, had in fact been a liability, a gap in coverage that someone had just tried to exploit with a high-powered rifle on an elevated bypass. I want to see everything on that board, she said. Tomorrow. Now. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he pulled the second chair from against the wall, turned it to face the corkboard, and sat down. Start at the left side, he said. The photographs there are oldest. They stayed in the archive room until 5 a.m. She asked questions, and he answered them with the careful specificity of someone who had been carrying information alone for a long time and found the act of sharing it physically complicated. She could see it in the way he chose words, the slight delay before certain answers, the way he would sometimes stop and look at a point on the board and then redirect. He wasn't lying. He was editing, and she let him because she understood she was getting more tonight than she had any right to expect, and because she needed to understand the shape of what she'd walked into before she could determine how to move through it. What emerged from those 2 hours was a picture that was both clearer and more frightening than anything she had assembled on her own. Her father had been part of a financial intelligence operation targeting a network that called itself, in the documents he had compiled, the Meridian Compact, a loose alliance of organized crime groups, corrupted institutional investors, and a cluster of federal officials who had been running money through legitimate infrastructure for 2 decades. The Compact's operating model was elegant in the way that long-running crimes were elegant. Nothing moved in ways that triggered conventional flags. Everything was distributed, the paper trails looped through jurisdictions that didn't share information well. Her father's job had been to trace the money. He had been very good at it. The problem was that the Compact had someone inside Damien's organization, possibly more than one someone, and when Martin Cross had gotten close enough to the center of things, that someone had whispered, and the walls had collapsed. Did you know, Elena said at one point, when it was happening, did you know there was a leak?
I knew something had gone wrong, Damien said. I didn't know the specificity until afterward. By the time I understood what had happened, your parents were gone and the evidence was gone with them. And the person inside your organization. Still there, he said. Presumably. Or connected to someone still there. That's why the security around you is what it is.
That's why I haven't told my full inner circle about you or about why you're here. Elena looked at him sideways. You're telling me that someone in your organization might be responsible for my parents' disappearance and you still don't know who it is? Yes. And you brought me into this house. Into the most secure location I have access to, yes. That's... She stopped. That's a sentence that needs a different ending. I know, he said. I'm working on it. She almost laughed. It surprised her enough that she pressed her lips together against it, and he noticed, she could see him notice, and something in his face registered it without comment, which she appreciated more than she expected to. She went back to her room at 5:15 and sat on the edge of the bed and thought about her father standing outside a building she didn't know, in a coat she remembered from when she was 19, and the word operational written on the back in someone else's hand. She thought about Milo, 61 pounds in a hospital bed, who did not know any of this and who needed not to, for as long as possible because Milo's one job right now was to survive his surgery, and there was no version of that job that included knowing his entire family had been inside a conspiracy for as long as he had been alive. She thought about Damien's face when he said, I believe they're still alive. The particular texture of it, the way it wasn't comfort, wasn't reassurance, wasn't the softening of information for emotional management. It was a man stating what he believed to be operationally true, which meant it was either the most disorienting hope she had encountered in 7 years, or a careful manipulation so embedded in the structure of everything else that she had no tools to distinguish it from truth. She needed more information. She needed access to the board, more time with the documents, a way to cross-reference what Damien had told her against something she could independently verify. She needed, most fundamentally, to know who inside this organization had sold her parents. The second attack came 6 days later, and it didn't come for her. She was in the main kitchen in the late morning, a room she had started using because it was warm and large, and Della had, without any explicit conversation about it, started leaving a coffee setup on the counter nearest the east-facing windows that was exactly how Elena would have set it up herself, which was either attentiveness or surveillance, and she had decided to let it be both. She was reading through a document Damien had left for her, redacted in places, 3 pages of financial routing data that she had been trying to trace to a source, when she heard the sound from the east courtyard. Not an explosion. Something prior to an explosion. The sudden evacuation of air from a space, a compression that you felt in your sternum before you heard it, and then the sound, deep and concussive, rolling across the grounds and hitting the kitchen windows hard enough to flex the glass. She was at the window before she made the decision to move. The warehouse on the north edge of the property, a long building she had been told housed logistics equipment, was on fire. Not starting to fire. Already committed to it, the kind of burn that had been prepared, accelerated, that knew where it was going. The smoke was black and chemical. Damien's vehicles were already moving on the service road. She could see figures running. She could hear the radio traffic through the walls now, overlapping and urgent. Della appeared in the kitchen doorway. Her face was very calm in the way that spoke of extensive practice. Miss Cross, we need you to move to the interior room. What was in that warehouse? Elena said. Please come with me. What was in it, Della? A pause that lasted exactly long enough to be a decision. You were scheduled to be there at 11, Della said. Meeting with the logistics manager about the estate accounts. It was on the calendar Mr. Viscari maintains for security tracking. Another pause. It's 10:47. Elena looked at the fire. Someone had known her schedule. Not a guess. The kind of specific knowledge that required access to an internal calendar, an internal system. The kind of access that lived inside the walls of this estate. She went with Della without another word. Damien came back to the main house 3 hours later. He walked past the security room and past his office and directly into the sitting room where Elena was waiting because she had refused to go upstairs and Della had eventually stopped suggesting it.
He sat down across from her. He looked like a man who had been standing near a large fire for 3 hours, which he had. "You were supposed to be there," she said. "I know." "Someone with access to your internal calendar." "I know." His voice was stripped of everything except the information. "That's not a leak," she said. "That's not someone passing information out. That's someone inside this house." He looked at her steadily. "Yes." "Then I want to know every person who has access to your internal calendar. I want to know how long they've had it, and I want to help you go through them because I have been sitting in this room for 3 hours, and I have nothing else to do, and I am very, very good at following a financial trail, and I suspect the same skills apply to following a person." Something moved in his expression. Not surprise, exactly. The recalibration of an expectation. "You're not going to tell me to take you back to the city." "My brother is in a hospital being prepped for surgery by a team you assembled," she said. "I'm not going anywhere. But I need to be useful, or I'm going to lose my mind inside these walls." She held his gaze. "Let me help." The silence lasted long enough that she could hear the security radio from down the hall, the routine check-in, the acknowledgement, the static. "All right," he said. They worked through the afternoon and into the evening, cross-referencing the calendar access logs against personnel files, against the timeline of both attacks, against the financial records she had been reviewing. It was granular work, the kind that required sustained focus and a tolerance for the gap between what data showed and what it meant. And Elena found herself forgetting, in stretches of 20 and 30 minutes at a time, that she was sitting in the home of a man she had known for 3 weeks, that she was legally his wife, that there was a board in the East Wing archive with her father's photograph pinned to it. Then she would look up and find Damien watching her work with an expression she didn't have a name for yet, and she would remember all of it at once. By 8 o'clock, they had narrowed the calendar access to 9 people. By 10, they had identified 3 with anomalous activity in the 48 hours prior to each attack. By midnight, they had a name. Not a certainty. Something short of certainty. A pattern. A weight of circumstantial evidence that stopped at the edge of proof, but leaned hard against it. The name was Renata, a scheduling coordinator who had been with the estate for 6 years, who had access to the household calendar system, and who had, twice in the past month, transmitted files to an external address through a routing path she had clearly believed was obscured. It wasn't obscured enough. Elena put her finger on the printout. Her. Damien looked at it for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was very controlled. "She's worked for this household since before I took primary residence." "I know." "She knows my daughter's—" He stopped. Elena went completely still. He had not once, in 3 weeks, mentioned a daughter. The words sat between them in the silence of the office like something that had fallen from a height neither of them had anticipated. He looked like a man who had just heard himself say something he had not planned to say. His jaw was tight. His eyes moved to the window and then back. "You have a child," Elena said. The pause before his answer was the longest she had heard from him. "A daughter," he said. "She's 8. She lives under a separate name and a separate arrangement, at a location that only 3 people in my organization know. I'm one of them." His voice was stripped down to something near the bone. "Renata is the second." The room was very quiet. Elena thought about the attacks, the sniper on the bypass, the warehouse timed to her schedule. Someone inside these walls, with access, with knowledge, connected to a network that had already demonstrated it was willing to be lethal, and that someone knew where an 8-year-old girl was hidden. "You need to move her," Elena said. "Tonight." Damien was already reaching for his phone. The call he made was brief and conducted in a language she didn't recognize, with a focus that was absolute. When he put the phone down, he looked like a man standing at the edge of something he had spent years engineering specifically to avoid. "She's being moved," he said. Elena looked at him. In the harsh overhead light of the office, with the fire damage report still spread across the table between them and the printout with Renata's name under Elena's finger and the weight of the night pressing down on both of them, she thought about what it meant to keep a child's secret, to build a wall around the most important thing you had and maintain it for years while the rest of the world thought it knew who you were. She thought about Milo. "I understand," she said quietly. "More than you think." He looked at her. For the first time since she had met him, the controlled surface of him had a visible fault line. Not emotion exactly, but the architecture of it, the structure that was holding something in. He held her gaze for 3 seconds, 4, and then he said, "You should get some sleep." "Damien." "Elena." "We're going to find who did this," she said. "All of it. Renata, whoever she's working for, whoever was on that bypass, all of it." She meant it the way she meant the things she said to Milo. Not as comfort, not as reassurance, but as a statement of operational intent. "And then I want to know where my parents are." Something moved across his face. Something she'd been watching for without knowing she was watching for it. The point at which the careful management of himself reached its limit and whatever was underneath made contact with the surface. "I know where they are," he said. The floor went out from under her, not physically. She was sitting, she didn't move. But there was a sensation of structural collapse, a recalibration so fast and complete that for a moment she couldn't access language. She stopped. "You told me you believed they were alive." "I believed it when I said it," he said. "I confirmed it 5 days ago. I was trying to find the right time." "There's no right time for that sentence," she said. Her voice was very steady, which scared her more than if it hadn't been. "Where are they?" He held her gaze. "Safe," he said. "Protected. Not reachable right now. The arrangement is designed so that contact from this direction isn't possible without compromising their location. But alive. Both of them." The breath she had been holding for 7 years moved through her like something breaking open. She pressed both hands flat on the table. She looked at the surface of it, the papers, the printout, the cold ring where Damien's coffee had been hours ago. She breathed, in, out, the way you breathed when the ground had changed under you and you needed to verify that gravity was still operating according to its previous terms. Then her phone rang. The number was the hospital. She picked up because it was always the hospital. It was always about Milo. And because Milo was why she was here and nothing that had happened in the last 3 weeks had changed that. But it wasn't the surgical coordinator. It was a nurse who worked Milo's floor, and her voice had that specific quality Elena had learned to dread. The voice of someone who had checked the room and found it different from how they'd left it. "Miss Cross," the nurse said, "we need to—" "I'm sorry, we're not sure how to—" A pause. "Your brother isn't in his room." Elena stood up so fast the chair hit the wall behind her. "What do you mean he isn't in his room?" "He's not on the floor. We've checked the ward. The nurse's voice was careful and frightened. "Miss Cross, we can't find him." The phone was still in her hand when Damien took it from her. Not roughly. It was the specific motion of someone removing an object from a person who had stopped registering that they were holding it. He had the nurse on the line for 40 seconds, asking questions in the compressed, information-dense manner of someone who already knew which questions mattered. When he hung up, he was already moving, and Elena moved with him because standing still was not a thing her body was capable of in this moment. The drive to the hospital took 19 minutes. She knew because she counted them. Not deliberately, but because her mind had defaulted to measurement in the absence of anything else to hold on to. The city moved past the windows in its ordinary way, indifferent and continuous, and she sat in the back of the vehicle with her hands pressed together between her knees, and she did not speak, and Damien did not speak, and the 2 men in the front did not speak, and the silence was the most concentrated thing she had ever sat inside. The hospital's administrative staff were waiting when they arrived. Security had been called. The floor had been locked down 20 minutes after the discovery. Too late, the nurse had said on the phone, and that too late had been the sentence that was still running on a loop somewhere behind Elena's sternum, like a recording that wouldn't stop. Milo's room was exactly as he had left it. That was the thing that destroyed her for a moment when she stood in the doorway. The tablet on the bedside table. Face down, the way he always left it. The water glass with the bent straw, because the nausea made it hard for him to sit all the way upright. The small drawing she had taped to the wall across from the bed, so it was the first thing he saw in the morning. A terrible crayon rendering of their old apartment's view that he had made at age 7 and carried with him through 3 moves, and which she had put there because the world should contain something familiar when you opened your eyes in a place that smelled like bleach and bad news. She stood in the doorway and breathed through it. In, out. and then she stepped inside and started looking. Damien was in the corridor with the hospital's security director and two of his own people, extracting information with the efficient intensity of someone who had run interrogations before and had learned which questions broke through administrative caution fastest. She could hear the cadence of it through the open door. She let him do it. She was better in here. The room showed a departure, not a struggle. That was the first thing. Nothing overturned, no sign of resistance. The IV stand still in its position beside the bed, with the line disconnected at the port rather than pulled. Someone had taken the time to disconnect it properly. That meant either Milo had left with someone he trusted enough not to fight, or the person who took him had medical knowledge, or both. She checked under the pillow. Nothing. She checked the drawer of the bedside table, his phone charger, a packet of gum, a folded piece of paper she had not put there. She unfolded it. 4 words, printed in block letters from a device, not handwritten. We need to talk. Below it, a phone number. She stood with the paper in her hands for a moment, measuring the weight of it, the specificity of the choice to leave something rather than nothing. This was not a random act. This was a communication, calculated, deliberate, designed to move her in a particular direction. She thought about that for exactly as long as she could afford to, which was about 15 seconds. And then she took out her own phone and dialed. It rang twice. Elena Cross. The voice on the other end was male, middle-aged, with an accent she couldn't immediately place, something mid-Atlantic, something that had been worked on. I was wondering which of you would call first. Where's my brother? Alive and stable, the voice said. His medications have been maintained. He's uncomfortable but unharmed. That will remain true as long as this conversation goes well. Who are you? My name is Victor Salazar, the voice said. And I have been trying to speak with you for some time now, Miss Cross. Or should I say, Mrs. Vescari. She heard Damien in the corridor and stepped toward the door to signal him. He read her face in one look and came inside, closing the door behind him. She held the phone between them so he could hear. What do you want? She said. What I want is straightforward, Victor Salazar said. I want the evidence your father compiled, the Meridian files, everything Martin Cross collected before he ran. A pause. I believe you know where it is. I don't know anything about any files. That may be true, he said pleasantly. It may also be that you don't know you know. Either way, I think a conversation would be productive. In person. Another pause, this one timed. I'll send you an address. Come alone. If Damien Vescari is within 2 miles of that location, your brother will be moved somewhere you will not find him. The call ended. Elena lowered the phone. She looked at Damien. His face had done the thing she had only seen once before. The fault line. The place where the architecture of his control showed its stress. He was looking at the phone in her hand with an expression she could not fully read because it had too many components, and they were all very close to the surface. Victor Salazar, she said. I heard. You know him. I know who he is, Damien said. He runs a syndicate based out of the port region, second-tier operation, but well-resourced. He's been circling the edges of the Meridian network for years, not as a member, as a predator. He wants what the compact has, and he doesn't want to buy in. He wants to take it. And the files my father compiled would give him everything he needs to do exactly that, Damien said. Leverage over every family in the network. He wouldn't use them the way your father intended, not to dismantle anything. He'd use them to own everything. Elena set the phone down on the bedside table and looked at the drawing on the wall, the terrible crayon rendering of a view from an apartment they hadn't lived in for 5 years, that Milo had carried through 3 moves, 61 pounds in a hospital bed. Medications being maintained by a man who had just told her he wanted to use her dead or missing father's work product to take over a criminal empire. She turned back to Damien. Does Salazar know about my parents? That they're alive? If he took Milo, he's been running surveillance on us for longer than I realized, Damien said, and the tightness in his voice told her what that admission cost him. Which means... He stopped. Which means your information security has a second problem beyond Renata, Elena said. He didn't respond, which was its own response. She picked up the phone. The address had come through as a text from a blocked number. A location in the port district,
a warehouse number she didn't recognize. She showed it to Damien. "I'll send a team to the perimeter," he said immediately. He said alone. He said if I was within 2 miles. My team is not me. Damien, she held his gaze. He will know. Whatever he's built around this, he has enough reach to have known my schedule inside your household. He will know if your team is anywhere near that location, and then I lose Milo. She watched him process this. I have to go alone. That's not something I'm going to agree to. It's not something you get to agree to, she said. He's my brother. The silence between them was different from the other silences she had catalogued in this house and in this marriage. It had weight and direction. It was the silence of two people who had been moving toward something without naming it and had arrived at the place where the naming could no longer be deferred. I will not send you into a location controlled by Victor Salazar without support, Damien said. That is not negotiable.
Then figure out a way to give me support that doesn't look like support, she said, because I'm going. He looked at her for a long time. Then he pulled out his own phone. The address delivered her to a building at the edge of the port district that had once been a cold storage facility and now housed nothing obvious. A converted industrial space with high ceilings and the residual smell of refrigerant and salt water. She arrived at the time the text had specified, alone in a car that Damien's people had swept for tracking devices before she left, and fitted with two things she knew about and one she suspected she wasn't supposed to know about yet. Two men met her at the entrance. They checked her efficiently and professionally, thorough enough that they found the small transmitter in her watch and removed it without comment, which meant they had anticipated exactly that level of preparation. She let them take it. She had expected them to find it. The thing she suspected she wasn't supposed to know about was somewhere they wouldn't look, in a place she had positioned it herself after 3 weeks inside a household where she had quietly learned more about security architecture than anyone had intended to teach her. Victor Salazar was already in the room when she entered. He was shorter than the voice had suggested, compact, with a broad face and dark eyes that were very alert and very still in the way that some people's eyes were still when they were doing most of their processing below the surface. He was perhaps 50, well-dressed without ostentation, and he was standing beside a table rather than sitting, which she noted as a choice, the posture of someone who wanted to be able to move. Across the room, in a chair that was not comfortable but was not cruel, with a blanket across his lap and his tablet in his hands, and his face turned up to look at her with an expression of complicated relief, was Milo. She crossed to him first. She didn't run. She would not let Salazar see her run, but she crossed the distance in 10 steps, and she put her hands on his thin face with the dark eyes that were their father's eyes, and she checked him the way you checked someone when you had been told they were unharmed and needed to verify it with your own data. I'm okay, he said quietly. They didn't... He glanced at Salazar. Nobody touched me. I know, she said, even though she hadn't known. I know. She straightened and turned to face Salazar. Thank you for coming, he said, as if she'd had a choice. You wanted to talk, she said. Talk. He gestured toward the table. She did not move toward it. He absorbed that without visible reaction and clasped his hands in front of him and began. Your parents were not what you were told, he said. Not by Damien Viscari, and not by whatever story you built for yourself in the absence of information. He paused. I want to be precise here because I think precision is what you respond to, so let me be precise. Get to it. Martin and Sophie Cross were not operatives working against the Meridian Compact, Salazar said. They were working for it. Specifically, they were working for the faction of it controlled by Damien Viscari's father in the years before Damien took over. Their assignment was to compile financial intelligence not to expose the compact, but to give the Viscari faction leverage over every other family in the network. He let that sit for a moment. What your father ultimately compiled was a weapon. And when Damien's father died and Damien took over the organization, your father realized what he had built was going to be used to centralize power in the hands of one man instead of dismantling anything. Elena's face felt like it belonged to someone standing at a distance from her. You're saying my parents ran. I'm saying your parents stole the weapon they had built before it could be used, Salazar said, and hid it, and have been hiding ever since because the man they stole it from,
The man who told you tonight that he knows where they are has been looking for it for 7 years. The room was very quiet. Milo had put his tablet down. Elena thought about the archive room, the corkboard, her father's photograph, the word operational in someone else's handwriting, and Damien's voice saying, "I believe they're still alive," with the texture of operational truth. She thought about the deal, the marriage, the way he had known about Milo's diagnosis before she came to him, had been tracking both of us since your parents disappeared, he had said, and she had absorbed that as protective surveillance, the fulfillment of a promise. She thought about what surveillance for 7 years actually looked like if the thing you were surveilling for was not safety, but location. "He used me," she said. The sentence came out very flat. "He used the situation," Salazar said, with something that might have been precision or might have been the practiced softness of someone landing a blow carefully. "Your brother's medical crisis was an opportunity. The marriage gave him a legal claim, a reason to keep you close, and a very effective way to search for something your father may have left in your possession without your knowledge." Elena's mind was running back through everything. The way Damien had asked, in the contract negotiations, about her personal storage. She had assumed it was security protocol. The way he had asked, twice, in careful indirect language, about things she had kept from her childhood that held sentimental value. The way he had said your father might have left something with you, or that you might be leverage, framing it as Salazar's theory, as the threat from outside. When had she stopped checking whether the threat inside was the real one? "Where are my parents?" she said. "Safe," Salazar said. "Protected by people who have no interest in the Vescari organization or the Meridian files. People who helped them because they understood what those files actually were and what would happen if Damien Vescari got his hands on them." "And you want the files for yourself," Elena said. "That's what this is." "I want the files neutralized," he said. "Destroyed or delivered to the federal authorities who have been building a parallel case for 4 years. I have no interest in ownership. I have an interest in the network coming down, the entire network, including Damien Vescari's piece of it, which is the largest and the most deeply embedded." She looked at him. She was extremely good at reading people when she allowed herself to be, and what she read in Victor Salazar was not clean. He wasn't clean. She didn't believe he was clean. But neither was it the face of someone delivering a comprehensive lie. It was the face of someone delivering a partial truth in service of a complicated position, which was, she was beginning to understand, the only kind of truth that existed in the geography she was now living inside. "My brother needs his surgery," she said. "I know," Salazar said. "The surgical team in Boston is legitimate. Whatever else Damien is, he's not lying about the medical arrangement. Your brother will have his surgery. I have no interest in harming a child." "Then what do you want from me right now, specifically?" Salazar reached into his jacket and produced a phone, a clean one, a burner, and set it on the table between them. "I want you to go back," he said. "Back to the estate. Back to your marriage. I want you to find the files. I believe Martin Cross left something for you, something you've had without knowing it, something embedded in an object or a communication you received before or just after he disappeared. Find it. When you have it, call that number. We'll arrange the rest." Elena looked at the phone. She looked at Milo, who was watching her with his father's eyes. She thought about Damien Vescari in the archive room at 5 a.m., telling her about a promise he had made. The way the fault line had shown in his face when he mentioned his daughter. The specific quality of the thing she had started to feel in his presence. The thing she had not named because naming it inside a contract marriage to a man she had known for 3 weeks would have been a particular kind of foolishness. The thing she was now supposed to re-examine entirely. "I'll take him back to the hospital first," she said. "Of course," Salazar said. She helped Milo into the car. He was weak. The disruption to his routine and medication schedule had cost him, and he leaned against her in the back seat with his head against her shoulder, the way he had when he was very small and the world had been simple enough to fit inside the circle of one person's arms. She held him without speaking. The driver, one of Salazar's people, took them to the hospital and waited while she got Milo settled, while the nursing staff reestablished his line and checked his vitals and performed the careful professional management of a situation they had been instructed not to document in any form that would generate a report. She stayed for 40 minutes. She held his hand while he fell asleep, which happened faster than usual because the night had consumed whatever reserves he had. She watched his chest move up and down, and she thought about her father, in a coat she remembered, standing outside a building she had never seen. She thought about Damien saying, "I know where they are," with the quality of operational truth. She thought about what operational meant when the operation was not what she had been told it was. She drove back to the estate alone. The estate was operating at elevated security. She could see it in the distribution of personnel, the additional vehicles on the service road, the quality of attention at the gate. Damien was in the main foyer when she came through the door, and the way he looked at her, the fast, comprehensive inventory, the degree of tension released by her presence, she would have read as relief before tonight. She read it now as the look of a man who had just confirmed that a very valuable thing had returned to its controlled environment. She hated that she couldn't be certain which reading was correct. "Milo is back at the hospital," she said. "He's stable." Salazar. "Yes." "Did he—" "We talked," she said. "I need to sleep. We can debrief in the morning." He looked at her with an attention that had more layers than it usually did. "Elena." "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "I just need to sleep." She held his gaze with everything she had, all the control, all the steadiness she had been practicing since she was 19, and everything collapsed the first time. "I'll tell you everything in the morning." She went upstairs. She sat on the edge of her bed. She opened her hand and looked at the burner phone Salazar had given her, which she had palmed off the table in the moment she turned to go to Milo. A small, practiced motion that she had not planned, but her body had executed with the kind of instinct that only operates when something deeper than reasoning has made a decision. She turned it over in her hands. Then she opened the drawer of her bedside table, her own drawer, with her own things, the objects she had brought from her apartment when she moved in. And she looked at what was inside. The book she'd been reading. A photograph of her and Milo from 3 years ago. A small wooden box her father had given her on her 19th birthday, carved with a simple geometric pattern, the kind of thing that looked like a keepsake and opened with a mechanism that required knowing which panels to press in sequence. She had carried it through 7 years without opening it. She had carried it because it was her father's and because it was Milo's kind of birthday gift. Thoughtful and slightly nerdy, and made with care. And she had never opened it, because the mechanism had always felt like a puzzle left for later, and then later had stretched into 7 years of later. And she had stopped thinking of it as anything except an object that connected her to a version of her life that no longer existed. She looked at it now with entirely different eyes. She picked it up. It was heavier than it should be. She sat with it in her hands for a long moment, feeling the weight distribution, the slight density at the center that she had always attributed to the wood's thickness and now attributed to something else entirely. She turned it over. She pressed the panels in the sequence she half remembered, the sequence her father had shown her once, and she had filed away the way you filed things you were told in passing and expected to circle back to. The lid released. Inside, fitted precisely into a cavity that had been designed to contain it, was a small encrypted drive. Matte black. No markings, smaller than her thumb. The kind of thing you could carry for 7 years in a carved wooden box on a bedside table in 3 different apartments and a room in a Mafia estate, and no one would ever find because it didn't look like anything except the interior of a box that a father had given his daughter for her birthday. She held it in the palm of her hand. Meridian. Every name, every transaction, every corrupt official, every banker, every crime family including Damien Vescari's, 7 years of her father's work, compressed into an object she could close her fist around. And she was sitting in the home of the man who had spent 7 years looking for it, the man who had married her to find it, the man whose daughter, whose secret, hidden daughter, was currently being moved to a new secure location because of a leak inside his organization that Elena had helped him identify. The man who had said, in the archive room in the dark of 5 a.m., that he had made a promise to her father. She did not know which version of Damien Vescari was true, She did not know if the answer was one or the other, or something that couldn't be resolved into either. She knew that she was sitting on one side of a door, and he was on the other side of it, and in her hand was the thing that both of them, and Victor Salazar, and the people who had put a sniper on her car and blown up a warehouse timed to her schedule, had been circling for 7 years. She knew that she had less than one night to decide what to do with it before the morning came, and she had promised him a debrief, and she was going to have to look him in the face, and she was going to have to know, before that moment, which version of this she was going to play. She curled her fingers around the drive. From downstairs, very faint, she heard Damien's voice on a call. The rhythm of it, not the words. Controlled. Deliberate. The voice of a man who was also not sleeping, who was also running calculations in the dark, who was managing a night that had cost him something and was working out how to recoup it. She thought about Milo's hand in hers, the weight of his head on her shoulder. 61 pounds, and a surgery still ahead of him, and a tablet with YouTube and a crayon drawing of a view from an apartment they didn't live in anymore. She thought about what her father had built, what he had hidden, what he had apparently decided at the last moment that she should be the one to carry. She opened the burner phone with her other hand. She looked at the number Salazar had given her. She looked at the drive. She thought about what happened to people who chose wrong in rooms like this. And then she made the only decision she could live with, which was not the clean one, not the safe one, and not the one that either man waiting for her answer was going to expect. She did not call Salazar. She did not go to Damien. What she did, at 2:14 in the morning, in a room that smelled of old stone and the faint chemical residue of hospital that had somehow followed her home in her clothes, was think. She sat cross-legged on the bed with the drive in one hand and the burner phone in the other, and she thought with the specific, stripped-down clarity that only arrives when every comfortable option has been removed, and what's left is the architecture of the problem itself. Salazar had told her Damien used her to find the files. Damien had told her Salazar was a predator circling the Meridian network. Both of those things could be true simultaneously. That was the part neither of them had apparently calculated for, that she was capable of holding two contradictory narratives and refusing to collapse them into a single explanation before she had enough data to justify it. What she knew for certain, the drive existed. Her father had hidden it. The people who wanted it were numerous and had already demonstrated lethal intent. Milo's surgery was still scheduled and still dependent on arrangements that ran through Damien's infrastructure. And she was inside a house where at least one person beyond Renata was feeding information to outside parties, because Renata had been identified and contained, and Victor Salazar had still known her hospital schedule, still known exactly when to take Milo. She needed to know who the second leak was before she made any move with the drive, because the second leak was the variable that could destroy any plan she constructed. It was the open circuit, the uncontrolled current. She put the drive back in the wooden box. She put the box back in the drawer. She lay down on the bed in her clothes, and she made herself sleep for 3 hours because she had learned, in the years of managing Milo's condition and her own disintegrating financial situation, that exhaustion was a form of incompetence, and she could not afford incompetence right now. She was at Damien's office door at 6 in the morning. He was already there. He looked like a man who had not slept, which matched her expectation, and he looked at her when she came in with the focused attention of someone who had spent the sleepless hours running his own calculations and had arrived somewhere he wasn't sure about. Salazar said, "My parents were working for your father," she said, before he could speak. That the files weren't compiled to expose the Meridian network, that they were compiled to give your family leverage over it. She watched his face. She had learned his face over 3 weeks in a way that was more granular than she had intended, and what moved across it now was not the controlled surface response of someone managing a lie. It was something older and more complicated. The specific expression of someone confronting a history they had not chosen and had spent years trying to separate themselves from. "My father's arrangement with your parents was not what I was told when I inherited the organization," he said. "What I was told was that they were intelligence assets gathering exposure material. I believed that for 3 years. I found out the truth in year 4. He paused. "I spent year 5 dismantling every operational element my father had built around the Meridian network as leverage architecture.
That's documented. My attorney has the records. Why would your attorney have records of that? Because I anticipated that someone would eventually come to you with exactly what Salazar told you, he said. And I wanted there to be a verifiable record that I knew the truth and acted on it before I ever made contact with you. She stood very still. You anticipated this specific conversation. I anticipated that the truth about my father's arrangement would surface at the worst possible moment, he said. It always does. That's what worst possible moments are built from. She looked at him for a long time. Outside, the grounds were beginning to show the early gray of morning, the light that made everything look unfinished, like the world hadn't fully decided yet what it was going to be. There's a second leak, she said. Salazar knew my hospital schedule after Renato was identified. Someone else is feeding him. Something sharpened in Damien's expression. I know, he said. I've been running it since last night. I have a narrowed list. Who? He said a name she had not expected. It hit her with the specific force of something that should have been obvious and wasn't, and she ran back through everything she had observed in 3 weeks and found, with the horrible efficiency of retrospect, all the places it fit. Silas Moretti, Damien's consigliere, the man who had been at his father's side before Damien took over, who had navigated the transition with the adaptive expertise of someone who had learned to survive changes in leadership, who had been present at every significant decision she had witnessed, who had looked at her in those first days with an attention she had read as assessment and now read as something else entirely. Your consigliere, she said. My father's consigliere, Damien said, and the distinction was precise and deliberate. Who I kept on because I trusted his institutional knowledge, and because removing him would have destabilized the internal hierarchy at a point when I needed stability. His jaw was tight. A decision I have spent 11 years not regretting and am now regretting completely. Does he know about the drive? The silence before his answer was its own answer. He knows your father compiled something, Damien said. He doesn't know the form it takes or that you have it. He paused. You have it. It wasn't a question. She had walked in without the box, without the drive, without any physical evidence, and he had arrived at the correct conclusion from the way she was standing. She understood then that he was also very good at reading people, and that she had been allowing herself to forget that. Yes, she said. Since when? Since last night. It was in an object I've had for 7 years. She held his gaze. I didn't know what it was. He absorbed this. She watched him absorb it, the way information settled into him, the way he processed rather than reacted, the discipline of it that she had initially read as coldness and now read as the thing that had kept him alive in a position that killed people who were less controlled. We need to move fast, he said. If Silas has been tracking the situation, last night accelerated his timeline. He'll know Salazar made contact. He'll know we're narrowing. He'll try to get to the drive before we can use it, she said. He'll try to get to you, Damien said. The plan they built over the next 4 hours was not clean. Clean plans, she had come to understand, were the territory of people who had the luxury of time and controlled variables, and she had neither. What they built instead was functional, a structure designed not to eliminate risk but to direct it, to funnel the chaos of the situation into a channel they could manage. The core of it was this. Silas Moretti needed to believe he was winning. Damien called a full advisory meeting for noon. Standard format, the inner circle, the senior operational staff, the people who ran the legitimate businesses, and the people who ran the other things, seated around the table in the main conference room with the city visible through the windows. He called it on the grounds of the Salazar situation, the warehouse damage, the ongoing security concerns. Silas would expect it. Silas would come prepared to listen and to steer. Elena would not be at the meeting. She would be, to anyone watching the household's internal systems, in her room. But the internal systems had been accessed by Silas's secondary contact, a man in the IT infrastructure named Gale, identified in the early morning hours by Damien's security chief. And what those systems showed was being curated now, carefully, like a set being dressed for a performance. What Elena was actually doing, from 11 a.m. onward, was in the archive room. She had the drive open on the long table, connected to the room's isolated system, running the decryption sequence that her father had apparently designed to accept a secondary key, a key that turned out to be, with a neatness that made her chest ache, the geometric sequence of the wooden box's opening mechanism translated into a numeric string. Her father had built a lock that only she could open with an object he had given her, and he had trusted that she would figure it out eventually. She figured it out at 11:47. The files were extensive, more extensive than she had prepared for. 7 years of meticulous financial intelligence, layered and cross-referenced, with the organizational clarity of a man who had spent his career following money through the places it didn't want to be followed. Names, accounts, routing structures, transaction sequences that proved the Meridian Compact's integration into legitimate infrastructure. Politicians, federal contractors, 3 appellate court judges, banking executives in 4 countries, and a secondary file, clearly added later than the rest, dated 4 months before her parents disappeared. It was a recording. Audio, compressed but clear, from what sounded like a conference room, the specific acoustic of a space with too much table and not enough soft surfaces. Multiple voices. She put on the headphones the archive room's system provided, and she listened. She recognized Damien's father's voice from recordings she had found earlier in the archive. Heavy, deliberate, with the accent of someone who had grown up speaking another language and had learned English as an act of ambition. He was discussing the Meridian files, not their content, but their use, the specific leverage application, how each family's exposure would be deployed to enforce compliance, how the architecture of it would install the Vescari organization at the center of everything. And then a second voice, agreeing, laying out the operational details, enthusiastic in the way that people were enthusiastic when they had been waiting a long time for a plan to reach this stage and could finally see its execution. The second voice was Silas Moretti, but that was not what stopped her breathing. What stopped her breathing was the third voice, quieter, more hesitant, with the specific cadence of someone who was participating in something they were not entirely comfortable with, asking clarifying questions rather than making assertions, the voice of a person trying to understand the full scope of what they had agreed to. She had never heard that voice in a recording. She had heard it across a dinner table. She had heard it in an office on the 14th floor. She had heard it in an archive room at 5 a.m., saying, "I made a promise to your father." The third voice in the recording was Damien Vescari. She sat with the headphones on and the recording continuing past the point where she needed it to continue, and she breathed, and she thought about all the ways she had been reading him, the fault lines, the architectural control, the moment with the photograph, the specific quality of what she had started to feel in his presence and had deliberately not named. She thought about the attorney's records he had mentioned, the documented dismantling, the 5 years of separating himself from his father's architecture. This recording was from before that. This was the before. She did not know what it meant that the man who had apparently spent 5 years dismantling a plan was audible in the recording of that plan's conception. She did not know if it changed what she had decided or confirmed it or added a third variable she wasn't equipped to process in the 40 minutes she had before the meeting started and everything moved. She copied the complete file set to a second drive, one she had prepared, small and identical. And she made a decision about which drive went where. And she made it fast because fast was all she had. At 11:58, she left the archive room. The meeting started at noon. She was not in it, but she could monitor a single audio feed through an earpiece Damien's security chief had fitted her with that morning. Thin enough to be invisible, routed through a system Silas's contact in IT had no access to. She sat in a small anteroom off the main corridor and listened to the meeting begin. Damien's voice, controlled and even, laying out the situation. The Salazar contact, the warehouse, the security review. Silas's voice, measured and advisory, asking the right questions in the order a loyal consigliere would ask them. She listened to Silas perform loyalty for 11 minutes. Then Damien said, in the same controlled even voice, "I'd also like to discuss the secondary access breach we identified this morning. Gail Russo, IT infrastructure. Do you want to tell me how long he's been yours, Silas, or would you prefer I walk through what we found?" The room went very quiet on the feed. Elena stood up.
She was moving before the silence broke, because the silence breaking was going to produce a response she needed to be positioned for. She went down the corridor at a pace that was not running but was everything short of it toward the conference room, because whatever happened in the next 60 seconds was going to happen fast, and she needed to be there. She pushed through the conference room door. Silas Moretti was on his feet. He was 63 years old, and he moved like a man 30 years younger, with the muscle memory of someone who had been in violent situations and had learned from them. His hand was inside his jacket. Two of Damien's men were already between them, but Silas had the angle. The specific positioning of someone who had stood in this room hundreds of times and knew its geometry. Damien was very still. That was what she saw first, the absolute stillness of him, the way he had not moved from his chair while two of his men moved and Silas moved, the calculation of someone who was determining whether the thing in Silas's jacket was already committed. "Silas," Damien said. His voice had no emotion in it whatsoever. "Sit down." "You've been running this play for weeks," Silas said. His voice was different than it had been in the meeting. The advisory layer was gone, the measured quality was gone, and what was underneath was older and harder and not particularly interested in performance anymore. "You found Gail. You found Renata. You ran Elena Cross straight at Salazar to see what he'd tell her." He looked at Elena, who was standing just inside the door. "How much of it did you already know?" "Enough," Elena said. "The drive," he said. "Not here," she said. Something moved in his face. A rapid calculation, a compression of options. His hand was still inside his jacket. The two men between them were very still. Damien had not moved. "You want to know what's funny?" Silas said to Damien. "Your father trusted me with everything, 40 years. And when you took over, when you decided you were going to be something different, something cleaner," the word came out with a texture she hadn't heard in his voice before, something that might have been grief if it hadn't been so thoroughly converted into something else. "You kept me because you needed what I knew. You just didn't want to admit you were still using it." "I kept you because I trusted you," Damien said. "You kept me because I was useful," Silas said. "Don't mistake those for the same thing. Your father never did." "My father is why we're here," Damien said. The room held. Elena watched Silas's hand inside his jacket, and she watched Damien not moving, and she felt the specific gravity of the room, the way it was balanced on a point that could tip in any direction with any variable, and the variable she had not accounted for was the door behind her, which she heard open. She turned. Victor Salazar stepped through it with 4 men, and the geometry of the room changed completely. She had not seen this. This was not in the plan she and Damien had built. This was a variable she had not controlled for, which meant either Silas had coordinated this as a contingency, or Salazar had been running his own parallel track and had moved faster than anyone had anticipated. "The drive," Salazar said to the room in general. His voice was conversational. He had a compact weapon in his right hand that he held without theatrics. Just present, just a statement of position. "Whoever produces it fastest is whoever this goes well for." Silas looked at Salazar with an expression that was not surprise, which told Elena everything about the coordination. Damien looked at Elena. She looked back at him. Across a conference room full of armed people, with Silas on one side and Salazar on the other, and the weight of everything they had built together over 3 weeks between them. The archive room conversations, the corkboard, the 5 a.m. honesty that might or might not have been real, the recording she had listened to with headphones in a room he didn't know she had access to. She put her hand in her pocket. She produced the drive. Not the one with the files. The identical copy, blank, prepared this morning, identical in every physical dimension to the one that was currently in a sealed envelope in the possession of Damien's attorney with a chain of custody documentation that had begun at 10:30 a.m. Salazar moved toward her. Silas moved toward her. Damien moved. He came out of the chair faster than she had registered him as capable of moving, and he was not going toward either Salazar or Silas. He was going toward the window panel on the east wall, the one she had noted on her first day as inconsistent with the architecture, too thick, the wrong depth. He hit something on the frame, and the panel dropped, and behind it was a communication array that was very clearly not standard estate infrastructure, a broadcast system, encrypted, wide range, the kind of thing that didn't send to one recipient. The recording has been playing for 4 minutes, Damien said to the room. His voice was completely even. To 6 separate federal agency addresses, authenticated by the file metadata and the chain of custody established this morning by my attorney. He looked at Silas. Every name in those files is already in federal hands. There's nothing left to protect. Silas understood before Salazar did. She saw it in his face. The specific collapse of someone who had spent decades managing contingencies and had just watched the last one close. Salazar was still looking at the drive in Elena's hand. "That's empty," Elena said. "The real one left this building at 10:30 this morning." She held his gaze. "You should go. You have maybe 8 minutes before the agencies that received that broadcast start making calls." Salazar looked at her, then at Damien, then at the 4 men he had brought through the door, who were now doing the math of their own situation. He left. The room took a breath. Silas was still standing. He hadn't moved during any of it. The revelation, the broadcast, Salazar's exit. He was standing with his hand no longer inside his jacket, and his face showing something she had not expected to see on it. Not defiance, not calculation. Something that looked, stripped of everything else, like exhaustion. 40 years, he said to Damien. Not accusing, just the weight of it. "I know," Damien said. "You were always going to do this." "Not always," Damien said, "but yes." Silas sat down. Not arrested, not restrained. He just sat down in a chair, like a man who had been standing for 40 years and had run out of ground to stand on. Elena crossed the room to Damien. She stopped in front of him and looked at his face and thought about the recording. The third voice. The before. "The recording," she said quietly. "You're in it." He met her eyes. "Yes." "How old were you?" 23, he said. "My father's first year bringing me into operational meetings. I didn't understand the full scope of what was being discussed. I asked clarifying questions." He paused. "I've lived with that recording for 11 years. It's one of the reasons the attorney has a file an inch thick documenting everything I did afterward." She looked at him for a long moment. The conference room was in motion around them. Security personnel, radio communication, the specific controlled chaos of a plan reaching its execution phase, and in the middle of it they stood still, 2 feet apart, in the eye of something that wasn't finished yet. "Milo's surgery is tomorrow," she said. "I know," he said. "After that, Elena." His voice had something in it she hadn't heard before. Not the controlled, even register she had cataloged. Something below that, something that lived in the place below management. "After that, everything is different. I know, we'll figure out what that means." She thought about her parents, alive and hidden, about the drive, already in federal hands, about Silas Moretti sitting in a chair like a man who had run out of standing, about Damien at 23 in a room she'd heard through headphones, asking clarifying questions about a plan he had spent the next 18 years dismantling. She thought about what it meant to be inside a story and unable to read its ending. Then her phone rang. The number was her mother's, a number she had not called or received a call from in 7 years, a number she still had because deleting it had never been something she could make herself do, a number she had looked at sometimes in the worst months with the specific anguish of a door that might open and might be a wall. She stared at the screen. Damien saw her face. "What?" She held up the phone so he could see the number, and she watched recognition hit him. The confirmation that, yes, this was the number. Yes, this was real. And what that meant was that the broadcast had reached people she hadn't accounted for, that the movement of the files into federal hands had triggered something in the arrangement her parents had been living inside, that the wall had... She answered. "Elena." Her mother's voice, 7 years older, 7 years careful and compressed, and then, in a single syllable, completely unmistakable. "Baby, we saw the broadcast. We need to... there's something we didn't tell anyone, something that changes..." A pause. Static. The sound of a location that was not secure enough for what was being said. Silas didn't work alone. Inside Damien's organization, there's still... The call dropped. Elena stood with the dead phone in her hand and the conference room in motion around her and Damien watching her face, and Silas in his chair and the city outside the windows conducting its ordinary business under the early afternoon light. And she understood, with the absolute clarity of someone who had been running one step behind the truth for 3 weeks, that it was not over. That whatever Silas had been was the visible part, that her mother had been trying to tell her the name of what was still hidden, and that whoever that was had just heard the call drop and knew, with the same clarity she did, that she was one conversation away from finding them. The call had lasted 11 seconds. Elena counted them backward from the moment the line went dead, the way you counted backward from a sound you weren't sure you'd heard, trying to reconstruct the exact shape of it, the exact words, the exact place where her mother's voice had broken off. "Baby, we saw the broadcast. There's something we didn't tell anyone." Silas didn't work alone. Inside Damien's organization, there's still who, still what, still running, still hiding, still positioned inside the walls of this estate with access to things that mattered. She looked around the conference room. The motion that had followed Salazar's exit had not stopped. Security personnel moving, radio traffic overlapping, Damien's operational staff executing the response protocols they'd clearly been briefed on before the meeting started. Faces she had seen for 3 weeks. People she had assessed and filed and returned to in the course of learning the geography of her new life. She looked at each one now with the cold, stripping attention of someone who understood that the threat was not outside the room. Damien was watching her do it. "My mother said Silas didn't work alone," Elena said, quietly enough that only he could hear. "Someone else, still inside." His jaw tightened. "Your mother called." 11 seconds, then the line dropped. She held his gaze. Who in this room has the capability and the history to have run parallel to Silas for this long without you seeing it? That's not a small list. Make it smaller. He looked at the room. She watched him do what she had just done. The same stripping assessment, the same cold reconstruction of everyone present through the lens of a question he hadn't been asking until this moment. She watched the process move through his face like weather, controlled and fast. Then he stopped. His eyes settled on a man standing near the east wall. Late 40s, silver at the temples, with the quietly competent bearing of someone who managed things that didn't require visibility. Head of estate logistics. Name was Cord. He had been present at every meeting Elena had attended. He had been the one to brief her on the estate's physical layout in her first week. A comprehensive, detailed briefing that had, she now understood, also been a comprehensive, detailed survey of what she knew and didn't know. He had been in the room when Damien identified Silas. He had not reacted. Not surprise, not relief, not the micro-expression of someone watching a situation resolve that they had been anxious about. Nothing. The complete stillness of someone who had already known. Elena moved before she made the decision to move, the same way she had moved in the conference room doorway when the silence was about to break. She crossed the room at an angle that put her between Cord and the east exit, and she felt Damien move behind her, and she heard the shift in the room's energy as people registered that something had changed direction. Cord looked at her. His face was very still and very calm. "Your mother," he said conversationally, "Sophie Cross. She's in a residential facility outside of Bern. Has been for 4 years. Your father is 3 kilometers away in a converted farmhouse with a 2-person security detail that reports to me." He paused. "I've been their primary handler since they went into hiding." The room had gone quiet in the specific way that rooms went quiet when everyone in them understood simultaneously that the situation had changed. "Handler," Elena said. "Your father didn't run from Damien's organization," Cord said. "He ran from Silas. Silas was the one who sold him to the compact leadership when he got close to the center. Your father came to me. I've been the one keeping him alive." He looked past her to Damien. "I couldn't tell you. I didn't know which pieces of what Silas had built ran through you and which ran around you, and your father didn't know either, and protecting Martin and Sophie required that the number of people who knew their location stayed exactly at 1. The silence extended. "My mother's call dropped," Elena said. "Why?" "Because when the broadcast went out, I called them," Cord said. "To tell them it was over. To tell them they could move. The call dropping was their security protocol. When a contact call extends past 8 seconds, it triggers an automatic line reset." His voice was even and informational. "They're probably trying to reach you again right now." Elena looked at him. She looked at Damien. She looked at Silas, still sitting in his chair against the far wall,
who was watching Cord with an expression she couldn't fully read. Something between recognition and the specific bitterness of someone who had been outmaneuvered by a variable they had underestimated. "You've been inside his operation for how long?" Silas said to Cord. "Not angry. Something flatter than anger." "Since before you consolidated your arrangement with Salazar," Cord said. "Since I realized what you were building and understood that dismantling it was going to require access you couldn't know about." "You could have come to me," Damien said. Cord looked at him directly. "With respect, I didn't know if I could. Not then. Not 4 years ago when I made the decision. You had kept Silas. You had reasons, and I understood them, but I didn't know if those reasons ran deeper than institutional convenience." He paused. "I know now, but I made the decision I could make with the information I had." Elena's phone rang. Same number. She answered it. "Elena." Her mother's voice steadier this time, the reset having given her 30 seconds to collect herself. Is it safe to talk?" "Yes," Elena said. She wasn't entirely certain it was true. She said it anyway because her mother needed to hear it and because the room was full of people who had made complicated decisions with incomplete information, and she had decided, at some point in the last 4 minutes, to extend the same consideration to herself. "Mom, I need you to listen. There's a man named Cord. He's been your handler. He's in this room." A pause on the line. "Cord?" her mother said, with a quality in her voice that was 7 years of complicated. "He kept his word." "He did," Elena said. Another pause. Longer. And then her mother said, with the specific weight of a sentence that had been held for 7 years and was finally being set down, "Your father wants to know if Milo is all right." Elena pressed her free hand flat against her sternum, just for a second, just long enough to register the pressure. "He's getting his surgery tomorrow," she said. "He's going to be fine." She heard her mother breathe. She heard, in the background, a sound she had not heard in 7 years. Her father's voice, asking something she couldn't make out, and her mother saying something back to him in the quiet shorthand of two people who had been in close quarters for a very long time. "We'll come home," her mother said, "as soon as when it's safe." "I'll call you tomorrow," Elena said. "After the surgery. I'll call you from the hospital." She ended the call. She stood in the conference room with her hand against her chest and her eyes on the middle distance, and she let the room be quiet around her for exactly as long as she could justify it, which was about 8 seconds, and then she put the phone in her pocket and looked at Damien. "It's not over yet," she said. "Salazar left. That doesn't mean he stopped." "No," Damien said. "It doesn't." What Victor Salazar did in the 3 hours following his exit from the estate conference room was exactly what Elena had expected, and exactly what she had prepared for, which was the part of the preparation she had not told Damien about because she had not been certain, at the time she made it, that she trusted him with all of it. Salazar went to the port facility. His ground, the location he controlled completely, and where he had resources and infrastructure and the operational confidence of someone who had been building toward this moment for years. He had not gotten the drive. He had not gotten the files. What he had instead was the knowledge that the broadcast existed, that the federal agencies had the authentication chain, and that his own exposure in the Meridian documentation, which was real, which her father had been meticulous about, was now in the hands of people whose job was to use it. A man in Salazar's position, with Salazar's resources and Salazar's operational history, did not respond to that situation by surrendering. He responded by moving, by converting assets, by destroying records, by reaching out to the network of contacts and favors and leverage that had kept him viable for 20 years, and attempting to construct a new position from the wreckage of the old one. What he did not account for was the federal response time, which was faster than anyone outside the agencies could have predicted, because the broadcast had not gone to 6 addresses. It had gone to 9, and 3 of those 9 had been building parallel cases for 4 years, and had agents pre-positioned at a range of locations, including the port facility, because the Meridian documentation had given them specific and actionable intelligence that they had been waiting to receive for a very long time.
Elena learned this from a call Damien received at 4:47 p.m., which he put on speaker in the estate's main sitting room, where she and Cord and two of Damien's senior people had been going through the logistical implications of the morning's events. He listened to the voice on the other end, a federal contact speaking in the careful language of someone who is providing information without technically providing information. And when the call ended, he set the phone down on the table and said, "Salazar is in custody. Port facility is secured." The room absorbed it. Elena thought about the drive, about her father's handwriting on the back of a photograph, about the wooden box she had carried for 7 years without opening, about the specific kind of trust it required to hide something in an object you gave to a person and believe, without any ability to verify it, that they would find it when the time was right and do the right thing with it. She thought her father had always believed she would. She wasn't sure she had believed it about herself until tonight. Milo's surgery began at 7 a.m. the following morning. Elena was in the waiting room by 6:15, in a chair near the window with a coffee she wasn't drinking and her phone face down in her lap. The surgical team lead had briefed her the evening before with the comprehensive, technically precise warmth of someone who was very good at their job and understood that the person across from them needed both categories simultaneously. The procedure would take between 4 and 6 hours. The 73% success rate she had been quoted months ago had been revised upward to 81 on the basis of Milo's response to the pre-surgical protocol. 81%. She had held that number overnight like something physical. Damien arrived at 6:50. She had not asked him to come. She had not told him not to. He came through the waiting room door in clothes that looked like he had also not slept, with 2 coffees and a carrier and the specific quality of presence of someone who understood that the situation did not require them to speak. And he sat down in the chair beside her and handed her one of the coffees and looked out the window at the city beginning its morning. They sat like that for a while. "Cord's full debrief was last night," Damien said eventually. 3 hours. He's been running a parallel protection operation for 4 years without resources, without backup, on the basis of a judgment call he made alone. He paused. "I'm going to have a hard time being angry at him for the secrecy." "You shouldn't be," Elena said. "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "He's agreed to stay on. Different role, direct report structure, nothing lateral. He'll run the transition oversight." "Transition to what?"
Damien turned the coffee cup in his hands. It was a small, slightly restless motion, the only one she had ever seen him make that wasn't completely deliberate. The legitimate holdings represent about 60% of the organization's total footprint at this point. I've been moving toward a full transition for 3 years. The Meridian exposure accelerates the timeline, but it doesn't change the direction. He looked at her sideways. "I'm not going to ask you to be part of something I'm in the process of dismantling." She looked at him. "And the 40%? Some of it I can convert. Some of it I'll sever. Some of it will fight me." His voice was even, stripped of self-pity or heroism, just the facts of the terrain. "It won't be clean. Nothing I've done has been clean, but it'll be real." She thought about the recording, 23 years old, asking clarifying questions in a room where terrible things were being planned. She thought about 18 years of documented dismantling. She thought about Cord and Martin Cross and the specific arithmetic of trust, the ways it was built not in single moments of declaration, but in the accumulation of decisions made when no one who mattered was watching. "The contract," she said. "You can dissolve it whenever you want," he said. "Today, if you want. The medical arrangement for Milo is unconditional. It's documented separately. It doesn't depend on the marriage. Whatever you decide, that doesn't change." She looked at the window, looked at Todd. The city was fully light now, the ordinary morning traffic of a place that didn't know what had happened in its port district yesterday, or in the conference room of an estate 40 minutes north, or in the archive room at 5 a.m. weeks ago when 2 people had sat in front of a corkboard and started telling each other the truth. "I'm not dissolving it today," she said. He was quiet. I'm not saying I know what it is," she said. "I'm saying I'm not dissolving it today." He nodded once. Something in his face settled, not relief exactly, but the release of a tension she recognized because she had been carrying a version of it herself. The surgery took 5 hours and 40 minutes. The surgeon came out at 12:53 p.m. and said,
with the carefully modulated professionalism of someone delivering good news who had delivered enough of the other kind to know never to perform it, that the procedure had gone well, that the affected tissue had responded as they had hoped, that Milo would be in recovery for several hours and in hospital for a minimum of 10 days, but that the prognosis was, at this point, genuinely excellent. Elena stood up when she heard it. She didn't say anything. She nodded and shook the surgeon's hand and thanked him, and then she sat back down, very carefully, like someone who had been holding a structure upright through sheer will and needed a moment to verify that the ground was still there before she trusted it with her weight. Damien put his hand over hers on the armrest between the chairs. She turned her hand over and held it. She called her mother at 1:15. Sophie Cross answered on the first ring, which meant she had been sitting with the phone in her hand, which meant 7 years of hiding in a converted arrangement outside Bern with a 2-person security detail, and the specific daily terror of not knowing had not flattened her instincts about when the phone was going to ring. "He's okay," Elena said. "Surgery went well. He's in recovery." The sound her mother made on the other end of the line was not a word. It was the specific, involuntary sound that the body makes when it has been braced for impact for so long that the removal of the threat registers before the mind does. A compression of breath, a release, something that existed below a language. "Mom," Elena said. "I'm here," her mother said. "I'm here, baby." "Dad, he's here. Her mother's voice went sideways for a moment. Elena heard her father's voice in the background again, closer now, and then her mother saying, "It's okay, it's Milo, he's okay, the surgery worked," and the sound that came from her father's direction was the same sound her mother had made, the same language below language. And Elena pressed the phone against her ear and let it fill the space where 7 years of silence had been. They talked for 22 minutes. Not about Meridian, not about the files, not about Silas or Corge or Victor Salazar in federal custody. Those conversations would come. They would have to come. There was no version of any of this that didn't require those conversations, but not today. Today, her mother talked about the farmhouse near Bern and the way the light fell on the fields in the mornings, and her father talked about Milo, asking every question he had stored up over the years of watching from a distance that was designed to look like absence, and Elena answered all of them. When she ended the call, Damien was looking out the window with the deliberate courtesy of someone giving her the privacy of her own face during a conversation that was not his. "They'll come home," she said, "when it's settled enough." "I'll make sure it is," he said. It was not a boast. It was the same even register he used for operational statements. She had learned the difference. They went in to see Milo at 3 p.m., once recovery had cleared a short visit. He was pale and post-surgical and hooked to more equipment than he'd been wearing before, and he was awake, which was the only metric that mattered. He looked at Elena when she came in, and he said, in a voice made gravelly by the intubation, "Did it work?" "It worked," she said. He exhaled. His eyes went to the ceiling and then back to her, and then, with the specific kind of calculation that had always lived in his face, even when he was very small and the world was simple, to Damien standing in the doorway. "You came," Milo said. "Yes," Damien said. "You didn't have to." "I know." Milo looked at him for a moment with those dark eyes that held, Elena had always thought, a quality of judgment that was older than 12 years. The judgment of someone who had spent his formative years in medical environments where adults said things and then did other things, and he had quietly learned to take the measure of the gap between them. He looked at Damien the way he had looked at every adult who had ever made a promise in his presence. "Okay," Milo said finally, the same word he had said on the wedding video call, but different now. Not the same question wearing the same clothes, a different thing. "Okay." And then his eyes closed, not with distress, but with the heavy ordinary pull of someone who had come through something enormous and could now, finally, let the body do what it needed to do. Elena pulled the chair to the bedside. She sat down, and she put her hand over Milo's, and she felt his breathing even out beneath her palm, slow and regular and present in the specific, irreducible way that alive was present when you had spent long enough being afraid it might not be. Damien stayed in the doorway. After a while, she looked back at him. He was watching her brother sleep with an expression she recognized now. The fault line, the architecture showing through, the thing that lived below the controlled surface and was, she had come to understand, not the absence of feeling, but its most concentrated form. He had a daughter he had kept secret for 8 years. He had spent 11 years dismantling something his father built. He had made a promise to a man he couldn't find, and had waited 7 years to be in a position to keep it. He was not a good man, in the simple sense that the word sometimes wanted to mean. She was not a good woman in that sense either. She had broken into a locked room. She had palmed a decoy drive. She had made decisions in the dark without full information, and some of them had worked, and some of them still needed to be accounted for. The space between them was not clean. It was the space between two people who had operated in the gray for long enough that the gray had become the territory they navigated best. She held out her free hand. He crossed the room and sat in the chair on the other side of Milo's bed, and he took it. They sat like that for a long time, her brother breathing between them. The weeks that followed were not simple. The federal cases moved slowly in the way that federal cases moved, grinding through the documentation her father had compiled with the institutional thoroughness of organizations that were, at their best, built for exactly this kind of sustained work. Names from the Meridian files generated subpoenas, and then testimony, and then, in several cases, the specific public collapse of people who had believed their architecture was permanent. The appellate court judges, the banking executives, 3 members of a federal contracting oversight committee whose institutional positions had been the load-bearing structure of the compact's legitimacy infrastructure for 2 decades. Silas Moretti cooperated. Not completely, not without his attorney extracting significant concessions, but enough that the cases were stronger for it. He sat in a federal building and explained with the methodical precision of a man who had spent 40 years in meticulous operations and found, in their dismantling, the same habits of mind, how everything had been built. Elena read the transcripts when Damien's attorney made them available. She read them for the same reason she had always followed trails, because understanding the architecture was how you made sure it couldn't be rebuilt. Victor Salazar's cooperation was more limited. He hired better attorneys and made a different set of calculations, and the outcome was a longer process with less resolution at the human level, which was the nature of the thing. He would not escape the documentation. He was simply going to make the escape take longer. Martin and Sophie Cross came home 6 weeks after Milo's surgery. They came on a Tuesday afternoon on a flight Elena did not know the number of, until Cord texted her at noon. The same Cord who had been running logistics for the estate for 4 years while simultaneously managing a protection operation on 2 continents. The same Cord who had looked at her in that conference room and told her the truth with the flat precision of someone who had been waiting a long time to be able to. She drove to the airport alone. She stood in the arrivals hall with her hands in her pockets and the ordinary afternoon crowd moving around her, and she watched the doors, and when they opened and her father came through them, thinner than she remembered, with 7 years in his face that hadn't been there before, in a coat that was not the one from the photograph. She walked toward him without thinking, and he walked toward her, and when they reached each other, he put his arms around her, and she felt, in the specific physical reality of that embrace, all the weight of the years that had not contained it, her mother behind him. Sophie Cross, who had Sophie's hands and Sophie's eyes and 7 years of a different kind of hard in her face, who held Elena for a long time without speaking. Then her father said, with the economy of a man who had been saving language for the things that needed it, "Milo." "He's waiting at home," Elena said. "He wanted to come. I told him he had to let me do this part first." Her father laughed. It was not exactly the laugh she remembered, but it was close enough that the gap between the memory and the sound closed faster than she expected. "That's your voice," he said. "That's always been your voice." He looked at her. "You figured it out. The box." "You could have told me what was in it," she said. "I needed you not to know," he said, "until you needed to know. It was the safest." "I know," she said. "I know why." She looked at him, really looked, past the coat and the years and the absence, at the man underneath it, the man who had taught her to follow a trail and had trusted her with the most important thing he had ever compiled and had hidden it in an object that only she could open. "You should have told me sooner." "Yes," he said, "I should have." He said it without qualification or explanation, just the acknowledgement, plain and undefended.
I'm sorry. She nodded. They drove to the estate. Her parents sat in the back seat, and she drove, and nobody filled the silence with anything that didn't need to be there, which was the particular gift of people who had been through enough to understand that silence was not the enemy of connection. It was sometimes its most honest form. When they arrived, Milo was on the front steps. He was using a cane. His recovery was ongoing. The surgery had worked, and the work of rebuilding what the condition had taken was still ahead of him. And he was wearing a jacket that was slightly too large because he was 12 years old and still growing into the shape of himself. And he looked at the car as it came up the drive with an expression that her father saw through the window before he saw anything else. Her father was out of the car before it fully stopped. She watched them from the driver's seat. She did not get out immediately. She sat and watched her father go up the front steps and take Milo's face in both hands and look at him. And she watched Milo's expression do the thing that only happened when he was genuinely overwhelmed. The careful control he had developed through years of hospitals and waiting rooms, cracking at the edges in the specific way of someone who had not known how much they were holding until the moment something lifted it. Her mother made a small sound beside her and then got out of the car, and Elena sat alone for a moment with the engine off and the afternoon light coming through the windshield and all of it happening on the steps in front of her. Damien came out of the house. He stopped when he saw her parents. He had known they were coming. She had told him, they had talked about it. He had made every logistical arrangement with the thoroughness she had come to expect from him. But seeing it was different from arranging it. She watched him absorb the reality of it from across the distance of the steps, and she watched her father look up from Milo and find him, and she watched something move between the two men, complicated and unresolved and maybe unresolvable in the way that some things between people were, the history too dense to fully clear, but present and acknowledged and not collapsed into hostility. Her father nodded once. Damien nodded back. It was not forgiveness. It was not a clean resolution of everything that had passed between their histories. It was two people who had been on the same side of something and the opposite side of something else simultaneously, acknowledging each other across the years of it. That was all. That was, Elena thought, probably enough to build on. Not more than that, just enough. She got out of the car. The evening was long and full, and nothing was simple in it. They ate dinner together, all of them, at the long table in the dining room that had always felt scaled for more people than it contained, and now it was finally the right size. Milo sat between his grandparents with the specific proprietary pleasure of a child who has been returned something he did not know he was owed. He asked his grandfather questions with the rapid-fire intensity of someone who had 12 years of questions stored, and a finite window of attention before fatigue from his recovery would pull him under. Martin Cross answered all of them. Elena watched her father talk to her brother, and she ate, and she listened, and she let it be exactly what it was, which was not clean and not simple, and not the ending she had written for the story in the 7 years she had been carrying it. It was better than that. It was real. Later, after her parents had been shown to the rooms that had been prepared for them, and Milo had been walked back to the medical suite that had been set up on the ground floor for his ongoing care, and the house had settled into the quiet of many people sleeping under one roof. For the first time, Elena stood at the window in the sitting room and looked at the grounds in the dark. Damien came in after a while and stood beside her. "Your father asked me something before dinner," he said. "What?" "He asked if I was going to take care of you." He paused. "I told him that wasn't exactly how it worked anymore, that you were somewhat better at taking care of things than I had initially accounted for." She almost smiled. "What did he say to that?" "He said, yes, that's why I trusted her with it." He was quiet for a moment. "He meant the drive. I think he also meant something else." She looked at the grounds. The perimeter lighting was on, soft and even, the security presence reduced from its elevated state of the past weeks to something that was still present but no longer felt like a held breath. It felt like a house. It felt, for the first time since she had arrived in a vehicle after a ceremony with 6 attendees and her brother on a video call, like a place where people were going to live. "The transition timeline," she said. "Moving. I've got 3 meetings next week with the attorneys. The legitimate holdings will be restructured under a new operating framework. The rest," he paused. "The rest will take time. I told you it wouldn't be clean.
I know. Some of it will push back. I know that too. He turned slightly toward her. You're not going to ask me to guarantee it. No, she said. I'm going to watch you do it. She looked at him sideways. And if you don't? I know where the archive room is, and I know how the keypad works. The sound he made was not quite a laugh, but it was the closest thing to one she had heard from him, and it was genuine, unmanaged, briefly present, the sound of something real underneath the architecture of him, making contact with the surface. She turned back to the window. The city was out there, beyond the grounds, conducting its ordinary life in all its ordinary complexity. Its transactions and its betrayals and its careful arrangements, its long inheritances of harm, and its quiet, persistent efforts at something else. It did not know about the archive room or the Meridian files, or a 12-year-old boy recovering in a ground-floor suite or two, people who had come to each other through the worst possible circumstances and had managed, through some combination of stubbornness and clear-eyed decision-making, and the specific human refusal to stop trying, to arrive at something that might become something good. She thought about her father's face on the steps, her mother's hands, Milo between them. She thought about a wooden box she had carried for 7 years without opening because she had trusted, without knowing she was trusting, that the right time would come. I want to meet your daughter, she said. When it's time, when she's ready, when you think it's right. He was quiet for long enough that she thought she had misjudged the moment. Then he said, her name is Clara. She likes maps. She's been drawing them since she was 4. Cities she makes up, countries she invents, roads that go from places that don't exist to other places that don't exist. He stopped. She has my mother's eyes. Elena held that. She held it carefully, the way you held something that was being given to you and hadn't been given before. She sounds like someone Milo would argue with about geography, she said. Probably, he said. He'd probably be right. She gets the details wrong on purpose to see if anyone notices. The night was very quiet outside. She did not reach for his hand this time, and he did not reach for hers, and that was fine. There was time for that. There was the whole ordinary structure of days ahead in which that kind of reaching happened or didn't happen, and both were real. What they had right now was this. 2 people standing at a window in a house full of sleeping people they had fought for, looking at a city that didn't know their names, in the first genuine quiet of a very long storm. It was enough. It was, she thought, with the particular precision of someone who had spent her whole life following trails to their conclusions and had finally arrived at one that didn't end in absence. More than enough. Outside, the first light of morning was beginning to define the edge of the horizon, barely there. Just the suggestion of it, the city's silhouette emerging from the dark in pieces, the way things became visible not all at once, but gradually, each part finding its shape as the light increased. She watched it come.